Hello all, deck profile time once again, finally back at it with the Despias. This is probably one of my favorite decks to ever play at this point. I'm glad I get to keep doing this, and I'm really glad that we're getting more support for this later on, because just a little after Branded Fusion was announced, and good god is that card ridiculously strong. But here's a version of the deck that obviously is not playing it because it's not out yet, but here is Despia Albaz as it currently stands. Here is my build of it. Let's get right into it. First off, 3 Owlbear. Thankfully, I am seeing much more builds that actually play 3 of this card because they're realizing that you actually need to get to your engine. I understand why builds are playing less of this for 2 reasons. 1, you can search it out with other things like Tragedy and Branded Opening. 2, this card's climbing up there in price, especially because Branded Fusion was announced. But if you can get 3, you really do need to be playing 3 of this, because, I mean, I generally try to suggest alternatives for some other cards, but there really is no replacement for Owlbear because this is the only one that searches branded spell or traps, so I really highly recommend trying to get 3 of this if you can, because this just makes the deck function if you're looking to play this, because it helps you get into all your stuff. More Despias, 2 Dramaturge. I just think the 2 is the correct ratio. I see some builds. 3 is too much for anything except for a pure Despia build. You don't want to break on it. And 1, I just don't believe is correct. This card does too much for this deck. It doesn't care if it's banished when it uses fusion material, and when it uses fusion material, it comes back. So it's an extra body. You can potentially end up fusing again under those circumstances. And it does have a semi-relevant disruption. When your opponent summons from the extra deck, you can target negate a monster. It's not the best, but it does force your opponent to attempt to play around it or have an answer for it. So this card just does too much for this deck, so I think playing 2 is correct. One that I initially wasn't playing, but then realized you can actually do a lot with this. I am playing 1 Ad Libitum, one of the newer ones that came out of Burst of Destiny. Like I said, I wasn't going to play this, but you can actually do a decent bit with this. So when this card is, when you use this card, you can essentially recur your Despia monsters from the banished and from the grave, and you can end up special summoning them back. And that does trigger some other effects. It does, like, it triggers Owlbear. It gives you potentially more fusion material. It can get you some resources back. And this does have sort of a relevant effect to boost up your monster's attack. That does end up coming up, but you more so want this for the special summoning. And it's another Despia name, because sometimes you just draw hands where you don't see any Despia names, and then you obviously can't fuse into your Despia fusions, which is very bad for you. So it's good in that aspect. This one is probably the most cuttable out of all the Despia ones if you don't want to play this, but this, I just think of too many scenarios in the grind game where this comes in handy to where I figured it was worth playing. And I mean, it's just the one of, so you can search it later on if you need it, but I am still on this because I think there's too many scenarios where it comes up. The last Despia monster, we are playing 3 Tragedy. And that should come as no surprise at this point. Tragedy is insane. People are starting to realize how crazy this card is. It gets you in your other Despia monsters. It can reset your branded spells and traps from the grave. It just does so much for this 1 card. And then to complement that, I am playing the 1 Foolish Burial as basically a 4th copy of Tragedy. I considered playing Gold Sark as well, but I'm already at 43 cards in this deck, so I'm pushing it as it is. I didn't want to push it even further with Gold Sark, so I just decided to go with Foolish Burial because it gets Tragedy into the grave, which is more handy than getting it banished, because then you could potentially use its second effects. So that is it for all of the Despia monsters. Like I said, you can cut Ad Libitum if you really don't think that you can justify the space for it, but I'm willing to take that risk because in the grind game, it ends up saving you more than it ends up hurting you if you're able to get to that point. This deck is Albaz focused, so guess what? We play 3 Fallen of Albaz. Yes, I know one of them is an Ultra, and that is because the United States Postal Service sucks and refuses to ship me my 3rd secret, which I have ordered, like, probably 3 weeks ago at this point, most likely more, but, you know, secret rare, ultra rare, they all still do the same thing, and it's hilarious. This card is super poly on legs. Of course, your opponent can respond to it, and it does target, so it's not as good, but you have so many ways to be able to get into this card off of the DSP, sentences, phrases, off of the Despia effects, and of course, out of one of the new cards from Burst of Destiny, Incredible Ecclesia. That's right, Sword Soul isn't the only one playing this, because it does say summon a Sword Soul from the deck, but it also says summon Fallen of Albaz. So guess what we get to do with this? So, of course, we're playing 3 Ecclesia. This card is just great. It helps you get in everything you need to do, and it comes back with all your fusion shenanigans, which is really funny. By the way, don't do what I did when I first played against this card. This card is, in fact, a quick effect. Do not shotgun your Imperm or your Veiler against this card, because your opponent is just going to change it, and it's going to dodge the card, which is really funny or really sad for you if you're the one who ends up playing into it. So do not fall for that, my friends. Onto the branded spells and traps. I am playing 2 of the theater. 3 is just too many. You don't want to brick on it, but I also don't think that 1 is correct, because hard drawing this every now and then is not necessarily the worst thing. It opens you up to search more branded spells or traps if you have Albaz, and you know, you can just get your fusion plays started early if your opponent disrupts you. Yeah, it's the invocation argument. You know, do you have it already? Cool, you get to keep playing. Then, you know, two of them I think is the correct one, especially because if your opponent uses Cosmic Cyclone on this, you cannot get it back, because you can inherently get this back with Tragedy in the grave, but if they banish it, then you're just kind of screwed. So I think that 2 is the correct way to go with this. One that is absolutely a 3 of, and if you are not playing 3 of this card, you need help. Branded Opening. This card is insane. Gets you into all of your Despias. Can special summon one from the deck in defense or add it to your hand. And by the way, don't get cheated out of this like I initially did with this card. This card discards for effect. The discard is not cost. So this, when you discard something off of it, it triggers things like Despian Tragedy. If you're playing a Shadal package, it triggers Shadals. This card is absolutely ridiculous when it comes to those. Do not get cheated out of that. And then finally, we have only 2 Branded in red, one of the newer ones, also out of Burst of Destiny. I'm only playing 2 of these because, I mean, as crazy as this card is for this deck, it's really good. You don't really want to brick on it because this one ends up coming up later on in your plays, because you do have to have your graveyard set up. You do have to add a Despia or Fallen of Albaz from your graveyard to your hand to be able to use the fusion summon of it. So, you know, bricking on this on your first turn really isn't the greatest. You more so want to search this out. Hard drawing it now and then isn't necessarily bad, but you, like I said, you don't want to brick on this. So I think 2 is the correct ratio in this particular build. In other builds, you know, I played a version of Despia where it's you run a Fright for a package and you try to turbo out 3 Masquerade Dragon. In builds like that, you run 3 of this, but in builds like this, you just run 2 of them, and I think that's correct. You'll notice a lot of fusion shenanigans in this deck, so of course we want to throw in some other fusions that may or may not necessarily belong, but I'm doing it anyway because it's funny. We are in fact running the Phoenix Enforcer package, so we are playing all the cards necessary for that because why not? The unfortunate part about this is you are unable to play Verte Anaconda in the extra deck, which makes it a little bit harder for you because you do have to hard draw the Fusion Destiny. And yes, there really is no way to get around this because majority of the time you are locked into fusion monsters, so you wouldn't be able to make Verte Anaconda anyway. But also this deck, you really don't have any spare bodies left on the field to be able to link into Verte Anaconda. You know, a combo deck that either gets disrupted or puts some extra bodies on the field is able to easily go into Verte and use Fusion Destiny. This deck just doesn't do that. You use everybody you can for the fusion plays that this deck does. You know, on top of you already being locked into fusions. So you do have to hard draw the Fusion Destiny, but I mean, when you do, I mean, you get your Despia plays online, then you get Phoenix Enforcer online, and just, you can overwhelm your opponent really quickly, especially with your resource recursion that your deck already does, and then you slap Phoenix Enforcer on top of that. It's just great. Getting into some of the tech cards. This card is hilarious in this deck, as I found out. I am playing 2 Eltlage the Golden Lord. This and playing Ad Libitum is the reason that this deck is over 40 cards. The 2 Eltlage and the 1 Ad Libitum are why I'm at 43. If you want to cut those and go down an even 40, that is perfectly fine. But this card is insane in this deck, as I'm finding out, for several reasons. One, It's a light, so it's good material if you just end up needing to use it for fusion material, if that's just what your hand constitutes. But there is a hilarious interaction with this card, Despian Tragedy, and the field spell, Theater of the Branded. So here's a few scenarios that can come up with that. Let's say you got Golden Lord in your hand as well as the Theater, and you already have Tragedy in the grave. Like, let's say you had to activate Branded Opening, discard this, summon Owlbear. You search the field spell, you searched another Despia monster like Dramaturge, but your opponent's got something problematic on the board. You Golden Lord effect, send this and the Theater to the grave, you out whatever the problematic card is. Then you Tragedy effect in the grave, banish it to reset the field spell, and then activate it once more. You have outed a problematic card, and you have your fusion plays online with this. And of course, you can do the reverse. Like, let's say these two are already in your grave. You can Golden Lord effect, pop the field spell, add it to your hand, special summon it. You have a free 3,500 body on the field, and then you banish Tragedy from the grave to reset this, and then activate it. So you have your field spell anyway. The interactions you can do with this card are just hilarious. It has way more synergy with this deck than I initially thought. So as much as it sucks to go over 40 cards, like I'm at 43 with this and the ad libitum, I just think it's worth the space because this is hilarious and this can really help you out. The main reason I was considering it was for things like Anti-Spell and Imperial Order. This deck just does not play through Anti-Spell or Imperial Order or other problematic floodgates, so that's why I decided to have a main deck option. But rather than have something like Cosmic Cyclone or Feather Duster, I decided to go with this because it just ends up having way more synergy. Like I discovered those things that it could do, and it's just hilarious. Obviously, it's not going to help you out Mystic Mine because this is a monster effect, and Mystic Mine affects the player, not the field. But in that instance, you really should be fine anyway. You know, you just put up a bunch of board presence monsters like Masquerade Dragon, Quertus. You essentially make it really hard for your opponent to kill you at that point because, fun fact, Masquerade Dragon still works under Mystic Mine, but we'll get into that later when I get into the extra deck. But that's why I am playing two Golden Lord. On to the rest, you'll notice this deck fuses with your opponent a bunch because of Albaz, so what better card to facilitate that than playing 3 Super Poly? Yeah, Super Poly needs no explanation. It is an insane card. On to the rest of the hand traps and the tech. I am playing 3 Nibiru because Nibiru is insane this format, on top of being a light, so you can use it as fusion material if needed. 1 Called by the Grave because we don't like Ash, we don't like Valor, we don't like Droll, we don't like any of that crap, so playing your Saki 1-of that can potentially save your life is great. 3 Infinite Impermanence. Finally got all my secret rares in all their glory, so love to finally be able to play these. And on top of that, Imperm is probably one of the best hand traps of this format, so of course we're playing 3 of that. And the final 3 cards I am main decking. There can be only 1 because this card is probably one of the biggest blowouts that you can play this format. You know, drop this against Sword Soul, they literally can't play the game. Drop this against Birds, you make them jump through a bunch of hoops and they don't make as big of a board as they can, or you force them to deal with it, or sometimes, depending on their hand, you just straight up end their turn. And then for the most part, you really don't care about this. I mean, it does hurt some of your plays, like a lot of the Albaz fusions are dragons, and Albaz himself is a dragon, so you can't do that. But the main deck Despias are all fairies, and your extra deck Despias are all fiends, so you can still go into them depending on the situation. And I mean, even if you turn off some of your deck, you really don't care, because as long as you're establishing a board and you're preventing your opponent from establishing a board, this card is doing its job, and if you're just winning the game anyway, it doesn't matter. So this card is absolutely worth it to play as long as it shuts down your opponent. That is the main deck. Like I said, 43 cards because of the 2 Golden Lord and the Ad Libitum. If you want to cut those, then you can obviously do that. As far as the Ecclesia, I know Ecclesia is an expensive card as well. I didn't talk about that. You can go without Ecclesia, but I mean, that does really hurt the deck in general, because one of the main purposes of this deck is to be able to get an Albaz and diffuse with your opponent's board. So having the Ecclesias really, really helps with that, but I understand if you're not able to get to Ecclesias because they're kind of getting up there in price. I believe they're about $55, $60 a copy right now, so I understand. In that case, you could make the deck go down to an even 40 cards, or you could just replace it with a bigger Despia engine or other hand traps. Beyond that, that'd be about all I could recommend for that. You can play without Ecclesia, but I would recommend trying to get them if you're going to do something like this. On to the extra deck, pretty much standard for any Despia build. We have 2 Quertus, 1 Proskinian, and 2 Masquerade Dragon. Quertus and Proskinian are pretty standard. I see some builds cut Proskinian, but in this deck in particular, Proskinian is really great because you're fusing with your opponent's board. So grabbing a Despia, a light, and a dark is... it can still be a little bit difficult, but when this card comes up, you drop this on your opponent, sometimes you just take such a commanding position that's hilarious. Like, people forget how crazy Proskinian can be. It steals opponent out of your opponent's graveyard or banishes it, and when it steals it, there are no restrictions. You get that monster's effect, it can attack, it stays with you permanently. I have stolen hilarious stuff out of the graveyard. I have stolen an opponent's Zeus, which obviously doesn't get the effect, but beating your opponent to death with their own Zeus is hilarious. I've stolen access code talkers. You're not putting any links in the grave, but I mean, popping the own access code that you stole to out something else is problematic is really, really funny. There's just so many funny things you can do with that card, so I really highly recommend playing it. Quertus is self-explanatory. Pretty much any Despia build is playing at least 2 of that, sometimes 3. And Masquerade Dragon. Oh boy, if I could make space for a 3rd one of this in the extra deck, I would, because this card is the secret MVP of this deck. The last time I was playing this deck, like I said, I was playing the Frightfur package. The goal was to turbo out 3 of these, but I consistently ended on 2. This card alone just wins you games if your opponent isn't able to answer it. I've gotten opponents down to 100, 200 life points, or some ridiculous low number like that. And if they can't deal with it, they're gonna take the burn. It's really, really funny. Fun fact, by the way, in case you don't know this, you should probably already know this, but if you don't, the burn is cost. That is not an effect. The card reads when your opponent must pay 600 life points to activate cards or effects. That is, in fact, cost. So, if you are under Mystic Mine, this card will still deal burn damage to your opponent. If you Dark Ruler no more your opponent, and then they wouldn't take damage for the rest of that turn after that. If they activate cards or effects on your turn when they shouldn't take damage, then this card will still burn them because the burn is cost. That's not them taking damage. And not to mention, it just comes back onto the field for free if your opponent has a ritual or an extra deck monster on the field. This card is insane. It's a free body. It's hilarious burn. I highly recommend playing this card in at least some capacity. If I could play 3 of this, I would, because it's just so funny. On to all of the Albaz targets. 2 Albion, the Branded Dragon. Definitely when Branded Fusion comes out, you're going to want to play 3 of this, because this card just gives you so much value. You fuse with it, and then you fuse again, essentially. So it's 2 for the price of 1. The card is just nuts. Sprint the Iron Dash Dragon. This is a really good Albaz target because the materials are Albaz and an effect monster special summon this turn. Nice combo your opponent's doing there. It'd be a shame if you fused with one of their important combo pieces. You know, it's just a really, this one's probably one of your best fusion targets that you can go into, just because you yoink one of their fusion monsters mid-combo, and then it's really funny. Brigand, the Glory Dragon. This is just another generic fusion target. Its materials are Albaz and a level 8 or higher monster. It also does have situational protection. It itself can't be destroyed by battle. And then as long as you control this fusion summon card, your opponent can't target other monsters with monster effects. It's not great, but I mean, some protection is better than no protection. And then we were playing 2 Titaniclad. Sprint is probably one of the better targets, but Titaniclad is going to be the one that you will most likely use the most, especially when your opponent gets into their bigger monsters, because people forget that Titaniclad can be summoned the normal way. There are more decks that play this than Dogmatica, and although we aren't playing any Dogmatica monsters, we do in fact use this card. The materials are Albaz and a monster with 2500 or more attack. And it does have a decently relevant effect to get bigger. So, I mean, that comes up, and when it does, it's hilarious. I've done this before. It's really, really funny. And then all of them have an effect that floats into another Albaz when it dies. So you essentially just do it all again, essentially. Yeah, really nothing more to say to that. You just want a bunch of these generic targets to be able to fuse with your opponent's board and then ruin their day with that and watch them suffer for it. It's sad, but funny. Anyway, you saw we were playing the Phoenix Enforcer package, so of course we had to play a copy of Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer. Obviously, if you can't get to this card, I know this card is pretty expensive, then you can just play one of the other Despia fusions, and then you can cut the package from the main deck, and, you know, that frees up a bunch of space for you right there, so that probably makes your day a little easier. I just think it's worth to play this card because this card needs no explanation. This card is insane. And then the final 3 slots, we're just playing generic Super Poly targets that you pretty much play anytime you're playing Super Poly. The Mud Dragon, the Starving Venom, and the Dragostapelia. Pretty much any deck running Super Poly is running those. That's it for the extra deck. Here is the side deck that I chose to go with. You can obviously change this up based on your local or wherever you're going, but here is what I decided to go with. Fun fact, you can side extra deck monsters. Of course you knew that, but I'm just saying that because this is the first time I've ever done it because it's hilarious. I am siding the Draglubion, Hope Harbinger, Numeron Dragon package because this deck can in fact go into rank 8 spam. Pretty much all the fusions except Proskinian are level 8s. Dramaturge is a level 8. You just have so many level 8 plays that you can do with this, and why not take advantage of that whenever you can do that? With this, I desperately tried to find space for this in the main deck. I just couldn't justify it because the main point of this deck is to fuse with your opponent's board with things like Albaz and Super Poly. So pretty much most of the extra deck has to be committed to that. And when I was toying around with the idea, I could maybe find 1 or 2 extra deck slots that were free. But obviously to do this, you need all 3. So I just figured, you know, why not side deck it? And then if it ends up coming up, then I can do that. Because, I mean, let's say you end up in a matchup where Super Poly really doesn't do anything for you. You just side out the Super Polys, you side out the Super Poly targets, and then you just put this in and kill your opponent in 1 turn. It's great. Or even if Super Poly is still a good card for you, you just side out some of the other fusion targets that really aren't doing anything, and then you just do your normal Super Poly Albaz plays, and then you just drop this on them anyway, and then just kill them for their trouble. You know, it's having flexibility with this in the side deck is still pretty good, so I would at least consider side decking this package if you are going to run this. The rest of the side deck, you should at least be siding Dark Ruler No More during this format. I tried to find space for this in the main, but I figured the main deck was okay as is. Realistically, I probably should try to find a way to main deck this, but I figured that There Can Be Only One was going to do the job anyway. We'll see if I regret that, but I am at the very least siding these. This is hilarious because I never thought I'd be playing these cards in 2021. Raigeki and Dark Hole are semi-relevant again, because if you catch your opponent unaware, you can just blow up their whole board with this. You know, so a lot of the bird players are going to playing Apex Avian instead of the statue, so they are putting up an Omni Negate with that. But a lot of bird boards are still, or at least a decent number of them are still running the statue. So if they put up their normal board of, you know, Cyborg, statue, follow-up, Nightingale, Drago Future, all that, if they didn't put up Apex Avian, there's really not a consistent Omni Negate there. And you can literally just blow up their entire board with one of these cards. You know, obviously Drago Future is still going to stay around, but Super Poly Goober... these cards are, what more can I say? I never thought these cards would be relevant again, and I have resolved these against some opponents' boards, and just seeing the look on their face when you drop Dark Hole or Raigeki on them in 2021 is just so funny that it's worth siding this. We don't like back rows, so I am siding a Feather Duster to be able to get rid of those. You better have the Judgment or your disappointment will be immeasurable and your day ruined, along with 3 copies of Evenly Matched, because we like to clear boards and we like our opponents to not be able to use their shit. And the last 3 cards I'm playing, I really debated over what I was going to make these, but I finally landed on Solemn Judgment because I just needed some more going first options. And I just wanted to be as generic as possible. I could have made these Drolls. I could have made these you know, Lancias or Ashes or anything else that's generic. But Judgment just says no to everything, so I figured it was the safest bet. It's obviously not the greatest card to play going second, but I mean, even going second, you could potentially keep yourself alive because this card is just a powerhouse in and of itself. So Judgment's just what I landed on, and I think it's a hell of a card regardless, but I think it's one of the best ones that you can choose. And that is pretty much all I've got for you. That is all of the deck. We'll see how it goes whenever I end up playing it. Either way, I'm gonna have fun with this. This is one of my most played decks recently, and I just have so much fun when I do this. So here's hoping this goes well, and I can't wait for Branded Fusion to be released because it's gonna make this even more insane. But yeah, that's all I got for you. Thanks for tuning in, and have a good rest of the day.